Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Mark Azulay. I'm here with Dr. Beth Kurland, and we're talking about vantage points, different ways that you can look at your life, different ways that you can shift your mindset in order to be not just happier, but healthier at the same time. So she is an author, she's a speaker, she's a psychologist. Beth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so I'm always curious. We often start a show with people's personal stories, right? And I'm a therapist, you're a psychologist, so we all have a storied history typically that gets
Yes.
us into
Yeah.
this field. I'm curious, how did you get started on doing this work?
Yeah. So let's see. I kind of think back to when I was quite small, even probably like school age, elementary age. I really was called to writing, actually. At that time, mostly poetry, but that was kind of my self
Hmm. Hmm.
expression, my chance to really explore whatever emotions were present for me. And I think when I look back, it's kind of like I think my writing at that time was my way of like mindfulness meditation.
Yeah,
That I didn't have a name for it, but when I would be upset about something, I would just grab my pen and paper and or inspired by something or in awe about something and would write. So I thought I wanted to be a writer. That was kind of, then leading up, fast forward to 11th grade, and I took a social psychology class in high school and I loved it. And one of the things that we had to do was to be paired with a younger student from middle school
hmm,
as a kind of a mentor. And so I would meet with this person, every week or something like that, just be a supportive person for them. But there was something about that that just really spoke to me. And so from then on, it was just, kind of became crystal clear to me that I wanted to follow this path. Um, so it was a kind of a straight shot for me school
hmm,
wise,
hmm,
but an interesting personal journey in the midst of all this because my mom died when I was 15, and so there was a lot of grief
yeah.
at that time that I didn't really know how to process. And so I think that I went through a lot of my early, late teens, even early 20s, kind of with a lot of these emotions that I hadn't quite made sense of and found a place for. Um, and it really wasn't until a little bit later on into my 20s and early 30s when I really dove into my own therapy
Hmm.
work, personal therapy work, that I came to kind of work with some of these really intense emotions that had been present there all along. Um, so so I guess that feels like an important backdrop for me of what led me to, and even with writing this book. So I wrote this book during the pandemic, and so I feel like I've been blessed in my career. I got to kind of have the dream of being a writer, and also
Hmm.
being a therapist. But I wrote this book during the pandemic, and especially in those early stages, both for myself. So I'm wired kind of on the anxious side, more high stress, I would say, just temperamental wise, from childhood. And and having some early trauma, I think
Hmm.
that,
Yeah.
rewires the nervous system as you know. Um, so there's it's kind of that for me. But going through the pandemic, both myself personally, all the uncertainty and fear, and especially in those early stages, and then sitting with so many people virtually,
Hmm.
all my patients, and we were all collectively going through this together, which is a very interesting experience as a therapist. There was this sense of how do we grapple with all of these intense emotions that are coming up for people, and and I was struck by this idea that even when happiness is not present, because I found myself, there was a point I wrote in my journal, like, I miss my old happy self,
Hmm.
like, but yet I felt that I could find well-being nonetheless, and could help other people find ways of really tapping into what I call this deep well of well-being that I think is this innate capacity that we all have. Um, and so that anyway, that was really the backdrop of writing the book. So it was very interesting.
Yeah, the pandemic was wild for our industry, right? Like you said, everyone was going
Yeah,
through it. It was the same session again and again of like, yep, didn't leave the house again, still lonely, still bored, still don't really know what to do. Or some people living in a lot of paranoia, right? And like, because it was unclear what the protocol was, and especially in the beginning, how serious this thing was going to be.
yeah,
There were people that, were washing their groceries multiple times, right? Or I had clients that set up like UV lights in their, entryways to like
yeah.
disinfect everything. It was hard to know if this was like going to kill people, right? Or if it was just something that was just kind of weird for a couple of years, which it turned out being
Yeah.
the later, probably because of vaccines working. But yeah, I'm curious about that for you. Like, I think it showed a lot of people their shadow because it took away their distractions and their social connections, and we had to sit with ourselves a lot. So,
Yeah.
in hearing you
Yeah.
talk, I associate also to Buddhism and this idea of just having to meditate, be mindful, and see what's underneath everything. Did you have that
Yes.
experience during the pandemic? Did it strip away some layers for you?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, when I'm trying to think timing wise, right before the pandemic started, like in that fall, I started an intensive training, a certificate class in mindfulness and psychotherapy.
great.
And I had studied meditation and mindfulness and so forth, in the previous years, but this was a really deep dive. And so that was actually incredibly helpful for me to have that because I would be, waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing with anxiety. My husband was a frontline worker for a period of time
Mhm.
there. Um, and for me to be able to have a way to work with those emotions as they were coming up, and to have some tools. And, I teach this stuff because I need to learn it myself, right? And it's what's been helpful for me as well. But when I could notice the nature of my own mind and the way that a lot of my own, let's say, suffering in that moment, 2 a.m., was my mind racing off to some place in the future, which actually wasn't here right now. Like that's helpful to be able to have a way of noticing that and then coming back to, okay, what's present, what's here.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I think the mindfulness and the Buddhist thought is critical. I mean, I've studied that deeply too, and it's changed my life. And I love hearing stories like yours where, yeah, you're a practitioner, but you're petitioning on things that work for yourself. I think there can be too many people in our field that are just all book smart and haven't actually done the work or done their own therapy. So it's great to hear that you are utilizing that in your own life, right? Because I think it just makes you a more reputable source, right? It makes you more trustworthy.
mhm. And I truly love to teach things that have been transformative for me and for
Yeah.
my patients. And, having sat with patients over 30 years, I
Hmm.
feel like it's been such a privilege to have a window into people's lives and to be able to support them through their challenges. And I think what's come out of that for me is just how common this common humanity is that we all experience, and I'll have guys coming into my office and saying like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm feeling this way or what's wrong with me or, thinking that like I must be crazy that I'm experiencing this stuff. And I'm like, no, you're human, and I've sat with, so many people that are experiencing something similar. So it's a relief for people, I think, to know that they're not alone.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so validating and I think confidence building to hear like, oh yeah, I've seen this before, right? And there's a way out, right? Like there are solutions, there are ways to get over, call it anxiety, depression, or loneliness or anger, or whatever people's issue of the day is. Um, yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've been doing this job for a while. I've been doing it for about a decade, and it gets wild to see the patterns emerge, and to see like, I mean, of course there are always outliers, but for the most part, people tend to cluster in a couple different archetypes of what
Yes.
really ails them.
Yeah, and what I found is that, and this book kind of touches on it, my previous book touches on
Yeah.
it, that there are these mental habits that we can get caught in.
Hmm.
And those mental habits, to some degree, have to do with our evolutionary wiring and our biological wiring.
Hmm.
And if we can understand those mental habits, then we can, and learn tools for how to
Hmm.
work with them, it really becomes a game changer.
Yeah, yeah. So let's dive into the book, right? So, right, the title is "You Don't Have to Change Everything." I want to start there. What do you mean by that specifically? That's a very catchy and evocative title.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people come into therapy, but certainly not just therapy, I think in life,
Mhm.
that we can go through life thinking that, I need to fix myself, I need to change myself, I need to become a new, improved version
Mhm.
of who I am. I'm broken, there's something wrong with me. Why am I feeling this way? I should be happier, all of these kinds of things. And so, and I think there's an emphasis in the self-help literature, although there's wonderful things out there, but there can be a little bit of message of that, of almost like, I'm not good enough and I need to change something to make myself better. And I need to change how I feel in order to be okay. And so I really wanted to turn that on its head a little bit and start from this place of, um, how do we meet ourselves where we are? And that whatever we're feeling, can we learn how to meet and greet and be present with that? I think that can be a relief for people to know, oh, I don't like have to get rid of this thing that I'm feeling, or as if it's bad, as if it's, somehow it's wrong that it's here. But okay, here's some tools. What do I do when I'm starting to feel this? Um, but so change, I think, comes about, at least as I've seen it and experienced it, most profoundly when we change how we relate to our inner
Mhm.
experiences. It's not about changing those inner experiences again as I have to get rid of or fix, but just when we shift where we stand. And that's where that shifting the vantage point comes in, where we shift where we're standing, our what we see looks different. And, so in terms of when we're talking about difficult emotions, a lot of times I think we are either caught in them, kind of hijacked by them, caught up in the, whatever is happening, that anger, that irritability, that frustration, that, it could be sadness, or we're avoiding, pushing
Yeah.
away, trying to suppress. And I think we're socially and culturally conditioned, I think especially, or, maybe more so even for men,
Mhm.
that there's that kind of social conditioning that certain feelings are okay, or certain feelings are okay to show or even to feel. So what do you do when that uncomfortable energy comes up in the body, which it will
Mhm.
time and again, because this is, this human life that we live in. And so instead of thinking I got to go in there and change and fix, it's like, okay, if I shift where I'm standing and where I'm looking from, things begin to change, possibilities begin to emerge that you hadn't maybe been able to see before.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying, and I work similarly, right? Where it's about coming to a relationship with these feelings rather than trying to like kill them, right? And I think it's a
Mhm.
struggle for men, just like you said, right? Because we are the more predatory sex, right? Like we do want to kill and suppress and like destroy things, especially bad feelings, right? Whether it's in us or in our partners or the people around us, right? When somebody is sad, men often really struggle how to deal with that because we're like, oh, just make the sadness go away, right? Just kill the sadness, whether
Mhm.
that's, through a joke or, through some version of comfort or through substance use, right? We're always doing that, but we're very rarely attuning and being with things like
Mhm.
sadness or grief, like you mentioned earlier. I
Yeah.
think men, like you said, we can feel like happy, we can feel angry, we can feel horny, and that's about it. Right? We don't get to feel sad. We don't get to feel jealous. We don't get to feel defeated. We don't really get to feel afraid. We have so many of these emotions that are behind these really thick walls. So I wonder when you're working with guys or when a guy is thinking about picking up this book, how can they build that kind of emotional intelligence and start to widen their aperture and have more of a feeling experience?
Yeah. So where to start? A lot of different, I
It's
guess,
a lot of threads on that one.
a lot
Yeah.
of different ways I could respond here. But I guess I would say, so the six shifts in vantage point that I talk about, in some ways they build on one another. In some ways they have to do with developing some mindful awareness to be able to notice what's going on. But sometimes I think about it this way, that we know more about our cars sometimes than we do about what's going on under the hood here.
Oh yeah.
And there's also a way in which I think, importantly, understanding what's going on in our autonomic nervous system actually is an important foundational piece. that we can, maybe just dive into a little bit at some point, because that becomes foundational for really knowing what to do with these turbulent energies that, you know, we all experience and that men experience and may not have learned what to do when this comes up.
Yeah, so say a little bit
Yeah.
about that. We do have some time before our commercial break of, working with the autonomic nervous system, right? Because you're right, it's not like a car. You can't just like take out a part and put in a better part. You have to work with it relationally.
Yeah, but we want to understand kind of what's happening underneath
Hmm.
the surface, right? And so if we can, um, if we're driving with the accelerator going, stuck on the ground going 60 miles an hour all the time, that's not gonna, give us a nice smooth ride. If we're driving with the emergency brake engaged, that's not going to give us a smooth ride either. And yet we have these protective and survival circuits
Hmm.
of our autonomic nervous system that evolved to help our ancestors survive, that classic fight, flight, and then the freeze response. And a lot of times we can sometimes be stuck in those protective circuitry without realizing it. And then, learning, I call that our old operating system. And it's there for a reason. It serves a helpful purpose. But we also have this newer operating system, and when we can learn how to access that, and I'm happy to, dip into that more, that can really be empowering in terms of then, what do we do when these emotions start to surface?
Yeah, so I'm hearing like one, hope is out there. It is possible to get an upgrade and to really gain some kind of, mastery over the inner world, right? So that it can be something that serves us and that we can really relate with rather than something that can control or push us away. I'm happy that we're
Yeah.
diving into the meat of the conversation. We're going to move to our commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to just dive into those 6 vantage points that you've been talking about and helping our listeners really understand how they can make a mindset shift right away. So thank you so
Right.
much for tuning in, and we'll see you on the other side of the break. Welcome back to the show. So now that we've set the stage for the fact that you can get better, you can help, you can build up your relationship with your inner world, and you can have emotions not be scary, but actually be pleasurable, be part of being human, like you're saying, Beth. So you talked about these different vantage points that people can move, through and move between. Can you say a little bit first about what a vantage point is in your view, in your framework?
Yeah, so a vantage point is really, I'm a very concrete person. So I think about sort of where am I standing and where am I
Yeah.
looking from? What's my viewing point? If I'm and in relation to difficult emotions, if I'm caught in the middle of the storm, so to speak, right? The emotional storm, well, I'm getting pelted with rain and snow and wind and whatever, and that's a pretty intense experience, right? Um, and if I'm trying to fight against that storm, that can be exhausting, especially because we can't always stop the storms, whether they're the internal or the external ones around us, or there's things we can do to help, right, bring ease
Mhm.
there. But this idea that, if we can find some safe shelter to stand under, or even have a protective raincoat,
Mhm.
that shelters us from the storm and be able to kind of watch from, a little bit of a step back. We're not swept away by it. There's a little bit more space, there's a little bit more distance to notice what's happening, what's going on in here, and what does it need? How can I attend to this, inner disturbance that's arising in a way that's wise and skillful?
Absolutely. Yeah. Before you dive in, I just want to talk to our male listeners, right? Like it's a rhetoric I say a lot, but this right here that Dr. Kurland's talking about, this is the hero's journey. It's like facing these inner storms and really like showing up with your eyes open versus pushing them away, which I think a lot of us have been conditioned to do. Is like deny that there's a storm. Oh, there's no tornado. There's no hurricane. But that's crazy. I think what you're about to talk about is really strength in my mind. Is like that's true emotional strength is and emotional honesty, being clear that like, yeah, I'm going through a storm right now. And like you said, how do I tend to it? How do I survive it? And how do I learn from it?
Yeah. And part of the challenge or issue, I think, for people is that when we, if you think about emotions like a pot of boiling water on a
Mhm.
stove, and if you just put the lid on it, eventually it's gonna spill over. It's gonna, show up in some ways, shapes, and forms that may not, you know, be intended. Um, but I think importantly, how do we find kind of a safe way of moving through these emotions so they don't overtake us? And so we want to not swing to either extreme, ignoring, suppressing, pushing away, the other extreme getting completely swept up in. And by the way, it's completely normal to feel just to be on both of the. I've been on that a lot, so that's not like it's striving for some unrealistic perfection here, but it's just knowing what to do. Okay, when I'm getting tossed about, how do I find that sort of stable middle ground place? Um, yeah,
Yeah.
and that's where the anchor view comes in, that first and most fundamental viewing point.
Great. Yeah. So dive right in. What's the anchor view? How would you explain that?
Yeah. So the anchor view is all about kind of going back to what I started touching on with this idea of the autonomic nervous system getting triggered. That when we go about our day, and we don't realize this, but below the surface of our awareness, we have the surveillance system that's always on. It's always looking for cues of threat and danger or for cues of safety. And that threat, what I'm referring to here in probably most of our listeners' day-to-day lives, could be an argument with a spouse or a friend or a partner. It could be a kid who's screaming, it could be just being stuck in traffic. It could be financial stress. It could be self-esteem issues, right? All those kinds of threats.
Mhm.
But our brain doesn't know the difference between a saber-toothed tiger and some of our modern day challenges. So what happens? It mobilizes our resources to fight that predator, quote predator, or to run away. And which shows up as our anger and irritability and anxiety and rumination and all these kinds of things. Or sometimes we can go into shutdown mode, which is another protective circuitry of the nervous system, that sends messages up to the brain, and that can be more like just kind of metaphorically pulling into one shell, pulling the covers over one's
Mhm.
head and just shutting down, shutting people out, that kind of response. And it's normal to experience that, that is part of our biological wiring, but it doesn't always give us the resources that are most helpful to meet the actual challenges at hand, right? If you're in the middle of an argument and you're sort of just yelling and screaming, it's probably not going to help, move that situation along in the best way. So that's where grabbing an anchor comes in. This idea of grabbing an anchor is actually means, how do we bring some more balanced energy into our autonomic nervous system? Because when we do that, when we bring a little more balanced energy in, we tap into this whole ventral vagal pathway. The vagus nerve has two branches, and I won't get into the whole thing, but it's fascinating that we have this more newly evolved circuitry of our nervous system and brain, and that when we can bring in enough cues of safety and balance for our nervous system, it kind of opens up this treasure chest that I think of it as. The treasure chest is that we can see a bigger picture. We can step back, we can problem solve, we have access to creativity, we have access to more compassion and self-compassion, we feel more confident. We can access all of these inner resources that are there, but when our nervous system is kind of out of balance and out of whack, it's a lot harder to do that. So learning how to grab an anchor is all about different practices that can help us bring that stabilizing energy. And so some of it has to do with breath work. And there's no right, I don't think there's absolutely a right answer for anybody, but these are things both in the research, my own experience working with people, that I've found most helpful. But breath work is one, using imagery is another, lots of different ways of working with the mind and body together, to just even interrupting for like 2 or 3 minutes, being able to take a mindful pause, that kind of thing interrupts those survival circuits and allows our cortex to come online, and allows us to be able to then step back a little bit. And it's like, okay, I feel a little more grounded and stable, solid ground underneath me. What is needed in this situation? So it can be a real, really helpful place to start when we're experiencing this inner turbulence.
Yeah, I like that, right? Just grounding and finding a way to kind of short circuit the emotional storm. Because, like you said, if we're being hijacked by those more limbic brain, right, lower function things, we're not going to be able to use any skills at that point, right? We're just going to lose our mind and, like you said, either blast somebody or go and hide. What's the next vantage point when somebody gets grounded, gets anchored, is able to just like survey the situation?
Yeah, so the next one is what I call the child view. And that one, if anybody's had a chance to be around small babies, it's quite fascinating. There's this innate curiosity that children have, that children and even at a very, very young age have. And it's this curiosity to turn towards things and to explore, to pick up a crumpled piece of paper and be like, oh, wow, what is this? This is interesting, right? Well, we don't, because we're wired typically with our more unpleasant emotions, to push them away, and again, there was some evolutionary value for avoiding, what was unpleasant and seeking what's pleasant, right? So we have this innate wiring. We have this socialization that also feeds that. So when we come up against these uncomfortable emotions, or even these thoughts that are going through our head, or physical sensations in our bodies, we're often tuned out. We're on automatic pilot. We're not even aware that these messages and signals are going on underneath the surface. And so the child view is all about cultivating some curiosity, which is an essential part, I think, of mindful awareness, to be able to, like, can I start to really get curious? Like, what's happening here? Okay, wait a second. My partner just said something. Ooh, and all of a sudden, like, I just feel like everything just tightened up. And I can feel myself shutting down right now, right? But if I can start to get curious about that, curiosity, at least as I think of it, has a non-judgmental quality to it. It's not like, oh, Jesus, what am I doing? I can't believe I just, I'm feeling it, but it's got a gentler approach to it. And so that second vantage point shift is all about learning how to bring some curiosity to these
Mhm.
inner signals to begin to pay attention and be able to then listen to what is the wisdom of the body that
Yeah.
it's telling us.
Well, what I'm hearing is there's also that kind of mindfulness or that meditation, epiphany that people will have when they start to practice that, like, they are not their thoughts. As you're
Mhm.
describing this, you have, you talk about the you, right, which is this witness, this observer, this curious entity, this scientist in a way, like that's just studying whether good or bad. And then there's your emotions. And I think like
Mhm.
I should really want to underline that point because I think that is critical to do any kind of emotional work, quite frankly, is to be able to make that initial separation and be like, oh yeah, I
Mhm.
could be having thoughts. I could be having actually really dark thoughts. Like, if I'm a dude, I could think about leaving my wife. Or maybe there's a moment where I think about actually hitting my kid. I'm not going to do it, but I thought about it, you know?
Yeah.
Or I think about like going and drunk driving, drinking a bunch and leaving and running away and blowing up my life and becoming an avocado farmer in Belize or whatever, right? And
Yeah.
I think people, if they don't have that mindful awareness, they think that they take it seriously. They're like, oh, because I'm having these thoughts, this must be how I truly feel. This must be who I
Mhm.
am underneath everything, right? Maybe I am this monster. Maybe I am this violent person. Maybe I am a coward. Versus, I
Mhm.
think what you're saying, it's like, it's just phenomenon. It's just like, look at it. And the thing that you really are is the observer, right? Is the person that's in the
Yes,
vantage point. It's
that's
not the
absolutely.
storm around you, right?
Yeah. And I think we can become curious about sometimes, I think a lot of times for people that there's various kinds of trauma that people have experienced, some more of the intense
Mm-hmm.
big T trauma, if you will, but there's the small T traumas, right? There's a little the just the things that happen in third grade, being laughed at, or these early experiences that can shut us down. And then what happens is that, so even let's just use that example, somebody who got laughed at, say speaking out in front of the class when they were in third grade.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience, the survival brain comes in, well, that's dangerous. We don't want to ever feel that again. Okay, so walls go up, things shut down there. Now, fast forward to, maybe a job where you have to speak out in
Mm-hmm.
front of at a meeting or something like that. And the brain, starts to look for like, okay, is there a threat here that I need to mobilize these resources, turn on that survival and shut down or to fight back? And it could remember that, early experience. This is all often unconscious, right? Um, and then we have these reactions that we don't even realize where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of this curiosity too, as we learn to get curious, we can be curious about, is what I'm actually feeling, is it about what's happening right here in this very moment? Or is this also maybe triggering or tapping into something that could be older? Because it's helpful to differentiate that. It can
Mm-hmm.
be very helpful to do that.
Yeah, there's a great phrase that I was throwing around in my AA groups, which is if it's hysterical, it's historical. Right? If you're
Mm,
having like a reaction that just doesn't seem to fit, it's probably triggering something in the past. And that could be a
yeah,
good cue to be curious of like, oh, what's going on here? Um,
yeah.
so yeah, so you have the child view, and the next one you mentioned is the audience view. So how do they
Yeah.
move into that vantage point?
Yeah, so that one, I feel like the child view and the audience view, again, so there's a bit of a natural progression here, and
Mhm.
it kind of touches into what you were speaking about a few minutes ago. But once we start to get curious, and we can be curious about, our physical sensations, our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, like all of that, then we can I think of it this way. Imagine that there's a play, there's a
Mhm.
performance on stage. And if you are one of the actors on stage, you're caught in the middle of the drama. But now locate yourself in the audience
Mhm.
and you're watching that performance. There's a very different experience, right? There's a very different feel
Mhm.
to it. There's more space and distance between you and what's happening on the stage. And so there's this idea that if we can step back and become that observer, it's like deepening that ability to become the mindful witness, the observer of what's happening, not in a disconnected way, but in a very kind of leaning in way,
Mhm.
right? Then we can get curious about like, what are these narratives going on in my head? And how true are they? And, okay, I had this breakup. And now I'm saying to myself, I'm worthless. Nobody's going to love me. I'm never going to find anybody else. I'm no good, whatever, right? We all have these narratives that come about from whatever, just difficult events in our life. And we often do take those as truth, as you said.
Mhm.
We're so attached to our thoughts as if I think it must be so.
Mhm.
Or if I'm feeling it, there must be a truth to it. And so by learning how to take the audience view, we create a little bit of that space and distance to say, even just being able to add the phrase, I notice that. So instead of I'm so stupid, you know, uh, I'm a failure. If people can add the phrase, I notice that I'm having the thought that I'm so stupid.
Mhm.
I notice that I'm having this thought that I'm a failure right now. Well, right there, you just created a little bit of
Mhm.
that stepping back that loosens the grip
Mhm.
and invites in this idea that some of what probably a lot of what goes through our mind is like mental constructs that we can choose what we do with them once we see them for what they are.
Totally. Yeah. And like, just to reiterate your point, right? It's stuff often from our past. And if we have that story, like you talk about, the person that was, humiliated in third grade and they thought, oh, I'm broken, there's something wrong with me, or, nobody likes me, those stories persist. And they're going to
Yes.
find any kind of vague stimulus are going to play into those stories because the brain just wants those stories to be true because it makes the world a predictable place. Even though it could be a painful place, it makes it predictable.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And the more we can bring awareness and shine that, I think of the flashlight of mindful awareness, turning on the flashlight in a dark room, trying to get from point A to point B, you're going to be tripping and stumbling on things. You turn on that flashlight, the obstacles are still there, but the room's illuminated. You can see more clearly where you're going. And that's what these tools really allow
I
people
love
to
it.
do.
Yeah. And
Then
I
you
love
can,
that the flashlight is inherently non-judgmental, right? It's just light. Um,
yes.
right. So we're going to
Yeah.
move into our next commercial break. When we come back, we're going to go through the other three vantage points and really help our listeners walk through this whole process. It's been a great conversation so far. So hang on in there and we'll see you on the other side. Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Dr. Beth Kurland, the author of the book You Don't Have to Change Everything. And we're talking about the 6 vantage points that you go through that people can take mentally in order to deal with and cope and ultimately nurture, difficult emotions. So the next one on the docket is the compassionate parent view. I imagine this is when nurturing starts to come into the equation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, I think there's a kind of sequential piece here because if we can, ground and stabilize the nervous system, bring some curiosity, start turning towards, take that little bit of a half step back so we're not so swallowed
Mhm.
up in, and engulfed in our emotions, like all of that, then make space for how can we really be with some of this inner distress.
Mhm.
And I think, at least as I've seen in my own journey and in work with my patients, like that's where the real meat of the work, I think, comes in. And for men, I would imagine, and you probably can speak, much more directly from um, your personal
Mhm.
experience and so forth, but that's, you know, biologically women are sort of the nurturers, right? So there's a little bit more of that innate, built
Mhm.
in kind of caretaking capacity, and so this idea of how to help turn towards our inner emotions in a way where we can kind of give them the message like, hey, I see you, I'm with you, I hear you. Um, and typically, I think what happens is that if you think about um, a kid who's in distress, I use this analogy sometimes. A child, something disappointing happens, they're feeling sad, they couldn't get to do something they wanted to do, or something got canceled. And parent could have 3 responses. They could ignore that child, and that might give the message in some way. In that case, if the kid's really sad, just like, okay, well, what you're feeling isn't important. um, the second response might be, hey, stop your whining, cut it out and just like toughen up, right?
Mhm.
um, Third response might be the parent goes, puts an arm around that child and says, hey, yeah, of course this is upsetting. And I understand you're disappointed that this thing happened. And, I'm here with you and we'll let's figure out how to move forward. So I think most people would probably say, hey, I'd want that third parent response. Most of us, first of all, many of us may not have gotten that third parent
Mhm.
response. But we treat ourselves often like that first or second
Mhm.
parent. When it comes to our own inner, okay, I'm gonna kind of like just ignore, toughen up, or like I should snap out of this, that kind of thing. So this third vantage point shift is all about how can we meet and greet our emotions, kind of like, opening the door to our house as somebody's ringing the doorbell. You stand at the door, you keep them locked out, or you're not going to let them in and let them take over your house, but you might come, sit down. You want something to eat? Let's chat.
Mhm.
And it's kind of developing that ability to do that with our own inner emotions in a way that helps ourselves, instead of being disconnected from ourselves. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm I'm seen by me,
Mhm.
and that becomes a very powerful place from which change emerges.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really well said. And like you said, I think men struggle with this step because it does become that nurturing. I think that hunter-killer mentality that I talked about earlier comes online where it's like, okay, I've witnessed it, I'm aware of it, but you're really looking for weak spots. You're looking for figuring out how to kill it more efficiently versus the
Mhm.
idea of, I think what Dr. Kurland's saying is like being with it, nurturing it, and giving it what it needs. And it's a whole conversation for another podcast. But I do think in the modern era, men are being called to be nurturers in a much more comprehensive way, right? Like we
Mhm.
can't just be the brute anymore. We can't just be, the strong, tough guy. I think we have to be able to show up for our friends and our family and our community. And this is it. And we can't do that unless you do it for yourself, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of a pitch to learn some of these techniques that you're talking about.
Yeah. And I guess I kind of think of it a little bit like, if you have if your car's making weird noises or something, you're probably not going to ignore it,
Hmm.
you know? You're probably going to get curious and like lean in a little bit and try to attend to like what's there? What is the noise telling me? What do I need to pay attention to here? And it's a little bit like doing that for our own inner emotions and experiences. Um, yeah, and I think that men can feel like this one in particular is a little mushy gushy or that kind of thing. Um, but in fact, it's where I think so much power can come from,
Yeah.
that from that emerges from that place that I've seen time and again with, you know, um, men of all different walks of life.
Yeah, and just courage to know that like this thing, like you're not afraid of being sad, right? You're not
Yeah,
afraid of being
yeah,
hurt. You can actually show up and be with it. I think is really critical. Um,
yeah.
and I think also, if people are in relationships, communicating that to their partner. Because I think a lot of men do this unconsciously, right? There's a stereotype of the man cave, and I have a man cave, and I think we can
Mhm.
like retreat and we soothe ourselves, right? We engage in our hobbies, maybe we watch TV, maybe some of us drink, right? Like we find ways to soothe ourselves, but often men don't communicate that with their partners, and their partners end up being confused. They think that they're like retreating and running away. But I do think a lot of men know how to do this, but we don't know that we're doing it, and we also don't communicate it very well. We
Mhm.
just kind of like
Mhm.
abruptly take space and like handle it, right? Versus, I think, a much more gentler process that you're advocating for.
And I think that communication is key
Yeah. Oh
because
yeah.
there may be a little bit of an innate autonomic nervous system wiring of that shutdown, or maybe going into the man cave that might be important at times to replenish, right?
Mhm.
To regenerate, to whatever. Um, but if you can communicate, let's say to a partner, hey, I'm just feeling a little overwhelmed right now, or this is how I'm gonna, just take a little space so I can reconnect with you. That's a lot more helpful than maybe just retreating without that
Yes.
messaging,
A
right?
hundred percent. 100%. So yeah, let's keep moving on through your vantage points. So your next one is the mirror view. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this one that I think that for many of us, when we look in the metaphorical mirror, sometimes the real mirror as well, but we can often see what's reflected back to us is what's wrong, what's missing.
Hmm.
There's such a universal sense, I feel like, in working with people over all these years, of somewhere deep inside of us, I'm not enough. I need to do more, I need to be more, or focusing on our mistakes, the things that we messed up on, So we have this negativity bias of our brain that made it biologically more helpful to remember the negative things, to try to avoid them. But in doing so, we overlook the positive things. And in that, we overlook our own strengths and the inner resources that are already here to help support us. And so the mirror view is all about being able to kind of look in this metaphorical mirror that reflects back one's strengths and inner resources, the things that you're already, maybe many men may already be doing, but not really noticing, like, hey, I made that choice today, and that really helped move me in the direction of well-being. Um, so it's beginning to pay attention in a different kind of a way. I had a great mentor in right after graduate school, Dr. Robert Brooks, who taught me, and I'll sort of say it in this way, that change comes about not by finding what's wrong and fixing it, but by finding what's right and strengthening it.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can kind of flip the way that we see ourselves, instead of going through, I call it like the HOLE self, life looking through the lens of the whole self, we look through the lens of the WHOLE self, the whole self, and that includes our imperfections and all of these different range of emotions that we experience and all of that. But within that, we really begin to focus on what are the things that, even just the little choices each day that I'm making. Can I start to notice what's moving me in the direction of well-being and what's not? And yeah, but so paying attention to these kinds of strengths, and also, calling upon inner resources to help one. Let's say somebody's feeling fear about dating, or fear about giving a talk, or speaking up at work, or I don't know, right? Normal human emotions. So this mirror view can also help us really call upon the inner resources that are here. So maybe can I think about a time when I felt some courage? I don't know. It could be when you were 10 years old. It doesn't matter. It could be, a month ago, or when I was, in this setting. And if we can call upon that inner quality that we already have tapped into in some area of our life or some moment in time, and turn up the volume on that and have that sit side by side the fear. We don't have to get rid of the fear, we don't have to wait for that fear to go away to do that thing we're afraid of. But we can, call upon some inner quality that is there, that showed up maybe in a different area of our life, and have that kind of sit. I think of it as put it in the passenger seat next to us, and we can put fear in the back seat, and we can sit in the driver's seat and choose what direction we want to go. So
Yeah,
that,
I think that's great, right? And I think that's real strength. I mean, our listeners are probably familiar with Jocko Willink. He's a Navy SEAL dude, right? And like what he says is that it's not that Navy SEALs are not afraid, but they know how to operate while afraid. I think that's what you're talking about, right? It's like the fear's not going to
yes.
go away, but you can still be an effective human or partner or, business leader, employee, whatever, while you're afraid, right? And building that
Yeah.
capacity is really helpful.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we have time for your final view because we're coming towards the end of the show. But your
Okay.
final one is the ocean view, which to me, references spirituality. So I'm curious if there's like a
Yes.
spiritual aspect to this final one.
Absolutely. There's so much that could be said there. I guess different layers of this. And we could, get into the whole Buddhist,
Mhm.
some of the Buddhist teachings, and other spiritual teachings about this idea of interconnectedness. But I think, just on a simplistic level, there's a sense of, there's a quote by William James, who happens to be the father, thought of as the father of psychology. It's something like, the best thing we can do with our lives is to spend it on something that will outlast it. And I think of that often, and this idea of, um, some finding something that's outside of ourselves, greater than ourselves, that we can contribute to, or that we can, where can we find meaning and purpose in our lives? And it doesn't have to be grandiose, it could be just like, how am I showing up for my partner or my kids in ways that are, giving them some lasting, uh, you know,
Mhm.
resources that they're carrying forward in their life. But really focusing on this idea of finding meaning and purpose that extends beyond us. And when we do that, we feel more connected and interconnected with our communities, with our families, with our partners, with our, the world around us. So it's all about finding that connection by really, looking outside of ourselves.
Yeah, and I think for the guys out there, like emotions are connection ultimately, right? It's connecting through
Yeah.
emotions. If you're with somebody or you're doing something and you feel something, that's a good sign, right? You want to be touched by the world. So I think
Mhm.
to put some hope out there, I think when you walk through these steps that Dr. Kurland put out, you're able to actually be touched by the world and actually have a meaningful life. Versus where I think a lot of guys live, which is like a really really small aperture where we don't feel a lot. We do a lot, but we don't often feel a lot, and it seems like the stuff that we do doesn't matter. I hear that from so many guys. So I think when I think of ocean view, I connect with that idea of like actually being present and actually like having a
Yes.
real experience in the world.
I love that.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so Beth, it's been great to have you on the show. Where can people find more about you and get involved?
Yeah, so my website is a good place to start. Lots of different free resources on there, which is bethkurland.com, BETHKURLAND.com. And I have my books there as well. So that's probably kind of one stop play, easy place to, and the social media links there as well. Um, yeah, and I love to hear from people.
Yeah. And
So
if you like this, you got a taste of, I think, what's in the book. So certainly check out the book. Again, it's called You Don't Have to Change Everything. There's a link in the show notes if you want to go ahead and buy that, pick that up on Amazon. It's a great read. So check that out. It sounds like it's really a great pathway for becoming more human. So Dr. Garland, thank you so much for being on the show.
oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And thank you, listeners. Appreciate you joining in. We will see you next week on another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast.